During the last decade, banks in the United States have struggled, and in some instances, they have failed. In Canada, however, the Toronto Dominion Bank has flourished. Ed Clark, the president and CEO of the Toronto Dominion Bank, joins us today on the Ryerson negotiation project. A PhD graduate in economics from Harvard University, Clark gives us his perspective on the negotiating process. As a CEO, our guest has developed a team of highly specialized individuals who are mandated to do the acquisitions for the bank. Today, our guest will discuss his role and his thoughts on the negotiation process, including values, culture, preparation, and his approach to concessions. My name is David Dingwall, your host, and I welcome you to the Ryerson negotiation project. Where does governance at the bank come in on this particular issue? For instance, you're going to earmark a lot of time, a lot of resources, a fair degree of money that you're going to spend in terms of your due diligence. Is there an obligation on your part before a decision is actually reached about the acquisition to inform the board, engage the board? What kind of discussions, what kind of buy-in would you need from the board on those kinds of things?
Yeah, so I think this is very much a board role. I think boards can't micromanage an institution, but they ought to be fully involved in these major decisions. So at the start, the first critical issue was, should you go to the United States at all? And behind that was really even a bigger issue is should you grow the institution? We had very strong market share in Canada. We were very, very profitable in Canada. And so one answer would have been, well, why don't we turn the bank into effect to an income trust and just, pay a lot of dividends out, just run their thing and not grow. And our board took the view, independently imagined, it happened to be my view too, but the board had its own views on this, said no, that, I think the experience of most people on the board is, if you take that view, the organization dies over time, and that it does have to grow and keep adapting if it's going to be successful. And so if the goal was to really create a great Canadian-based bank that would be viable for the next 100 years, standing still wasn't one of the options. And so they were in favor of going in the United States. That was very important. And then, of course, they have to be deeply involved in, well, what the actual decision. One of the things that we introduced.
But would the board be involved in for instance, in saying, giving the CEO, and I'm not looking for particulars, but just generally, would the board be involved in saying, yeah, why don't you look at these 3 or 4 things over the next 2 years?
Oh, we constantly update the board to say, here is what we're looking at. Is there anything else? Do you have views that we should or we shouldn't? And what's the size? What's the bet that we're willing to take? All of those things are extensively discussed at the board. And one of our rules on the board is you have to have multiple kicks at the can. That you can't come with an acquisition and say, this is hot, I got to do this, I need your approval. Because they're the kind of things where you really do want your board member to go home, think about it for a while, and then come back to them and say, are you comfortable with this? The other rule that we've had with the board, which is an adaptation of sort of our learning from the financial crisis, is that what I now say to my board is, you could not take the vote on whether to support this acquisition until all the management, including me, leaves the room. And you have to actually meet alone without management. Because when I look at what happened in the financial crisis, banks really blow up for 2 reasons. Bad asset decisions or business mix decisions and bad acquisitions. Those are the things that are the killers for banks. And what you don't want is a very aggressive, powerful CEO standing there in the board and saying, I want to do this deal. Now I want to take a vote, because they can, frankly, overwhelm a board. And so I said, I think one of the things you should do is you should actually have me out of the room, all my management out of the room, take some time, talk among yourself, and decide whether you still want to do this deal.
Well, that's very good governance.
I think it's very important governance. Very important governance.
At the end of the day, would the board and the CEO agree to a mandate for those potential acquisitions?
Yeah, that's how in practical terms it has to be done. There's, in the end, thousands of details, and it's a long negotiations. And so we go through each stage and say, here's the kind of price point that we're thinking of. So we want to proceed in principle based on that price point. Here are the risks that we see. Here are the things that we're going to want to be able to get as part of the acquisition to mitigate those risks. And we try to highlight, in a sense, what is our obsession is what is the tail risk. So are there litigation risks, as an example? So if you look at the one that's in the marketplace today is, did the Bank of America board understand the potential litigation risk in Countrywide? You would hope that they understood that before they agreed to do that acquisition. But you want to now, when you look at acquisitions, not just look at what you're acquiring, but all the liabilities that you're potentially acquiring. And we try to highlight those for boards.
So there's a fair degree, not a fair, there's a lot of due diligence in the preparation stage that CEO and senior management would have to prepare for the board. And I would think perhaps after the discussions, there would be more due diligence that you would have to prepare for your board before the mandate letter has been agreed to.
Yes, I'd say I think everybody that's on the other side of a deal with us would say they have never seen the kind of due diligence that we've done. So we really believe, and we would typically, even in small acquisitions, have a 100 to 200 people involved in the due diligence. So we try to make sure that we have the best person in the bank on that part of the due diligence, that they're technically responsible. And we go through a process at the end where there's a large meeting, and there's often 200 people on the call, where they go through each of their items and they opine whether they believe what they've seen would cause them to do the deal or not do the deal. And we have our internal head of audit the due diligence and certify to the board that we have not changed the due diligence process from that we've used in previous acquisitions, so that the board is comforted that we're not shortchanging somehow this challenge function as we do acquisitions.
Are these kinds of rules that you're adhering to, are they a result of Sarbanes-Oxley, or is this the Toronto Dominion Bank?
This is our governance model. Toronto Dominion Bank. And I think it comes from the fact that we have done a large number of acquisitions. I mean, you get this literature that says, that 75% of acquisitions fail. What the literature says is 75% of the acquisitions fail because they're often one-offs for organizations. That the best organizations actually are people who are doing acquisitions all the time.
Can you elaborate, though, what you mean by one-off?
Yeah, so that CEO says, doesn't normally do acquisitions and say, but I'm going to make my career, I'm going to go and buy my competitor or merge with my competitor. And the reason that they don't do so well is that you don't actually have people inside who do this for the living. What we do is we've actually said no business leader leads the acquisition in the actual operational part of the acquisition. We have a special corporate development group. That's all they do. Every time we have, either very complicated contracts or acquisitions, they get handed over to that group, and that group gets paid on doing a good job, not necessarily doing the acquisition. And if we walk away from an acquisition because we think it was too pricey or we don't like the risks involved in it, we have a celebration for that team. And it's the same celebration as if they complete the acquisition, and they know that they'll be compensated for walkaways as much as they would for successful acquisition. So
well, that's certainly different from what I would think the general public would understand about the acquisitions. The public would be of the view, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that the particular company that wants to make the acquisition is that you would get a big financial uptake if you proceed with the acquisition. And if it doesn't proceed, well, you get nothing.
Yeah.
But you're telling me a little bit different at your institution.
Yes, we try to create the opposite incentives, because I think the thing you worry about is that people get deal fever, and they stop worrying about the risk, or they stop worrying about the price. And most business people who are good want to grow, and they want to drive their organizations. And so how do you sort of put a counterweight to that Well, you have a group that's all they do is acquisitions, and they say, no, 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 I've seen this before, I don't like this. And they get rewarded for standing up and saying, I'm not going to do this acquisition, no matter how much you like it.
How would they interface, for instance, with the senior operations guy who looks at the acquisition and says, now that's where we want to go. That's part of our DNA. That's part of what our mandate is all about. I think that's the direction that we have to go. What sort of interactions would take place between those two groups?
Yeah, so it's in some sense it's asymmetrical. The business leader must endorse the deal. So obviously, you would never do a deal that the business leader isn't saying, that's where I want to go, I want to do this, because the corporate development thinks it's a good deal. It has to be linked into the strategy. Go back to this. If you don't think you're going to add value operationally to what you acquire, you shouldn't be doing the deal in the first place. But if the business leader says, I want to do this deal, and the acquisition team says, we shouldn't do this deal, we won't do that deal. Obviously, it comes out of a discussion with me in the end where, I call that, but it wouldn't happen inside our organization, that if the corporate development said, I don't like this deal, that we would go ahead. The same way, the way we run our risk department is, in theory, I could overrule my chief risk officer, but I've never overruled my chief risk officer.
I want to come to risk a little bit later in our discussions here. Generally speaking, where does the whole realm of relationship and relationship development with the bank, where is it? Is it a value that you think is important for the bank in terms of relationships with other entities, whether it's other banks, whether it's something that you're trying to acquire? Where does relationship fit in as a CEO?
Yeah, so in our case, it's actually quite important, because we will be very rare that we would acquire something where we weren't trying to acquire management. I think other, people who do acquisitions are like fixer-uppers. They like things that are not well run but are also very cheap, whereas we would rather pay more and get something that's working well and that we're actually acquiring talent as part of the deal. But if that's what you're trying to do, there's a side process that has to go on, which is to recruit the management team that you're acquiring. So the clearest example would be when we bought the Commerce Bank in the United States, where they had a business model that was very similar to the Canada Trust business model. And so they're open 7 days a week, they're open at nights, they do these wow things, they give cookies to the dogs, they have dog bowls, all of that stuff. They have fun, make banking a fun experience for the employees and for the customers. Well, there was no point acquiring the Commerce and then losing that management team. And so it's quite critical that we recruit them as part of it and say, what I always say to people is, would you hire the people that are coming with the company? And if you wouldn't hire them, why would we buy the company? So when you look between corporate development and the business leaders, in general, the business leader's job is to recruit the management team. And their job is to go down and to sell the management team that we're trying to acquire, that if we acquire their company, there's roles for them, there's growth opportunities, and sell them on sort of the core business proposition that they will be able to do more with the entity that they're running now with us as owners than they would be by themselves. And that's very critical.
Have you, maybe not necessarily with the Toronto Dominion Bank, but are you aware or have you experienced whereby you've looked at an acquisition and you say, well, we want this, but we don't need their top people?
I doubt, I haven't, I'm trying to think of one, but we probably wouldn't buy it. And
Probably wouldn't buy it.
Yeah, we've definitely gone and looked at companies, said not a bad company, but they don't have the management team, and we don't have the management team to get in there and do that, and so let's just walk. Which is, I'd say, if you said, what's the critical issue in being successful in acquisitions is being willing to walk. Either walk before you go after them and say, no, looks alluring, but don't go there, or once you get in there and take a look. And so we would walk way more times, multiples of times. Probably we do one deal in 10 or one deal in 20. So we look at a lot of deals and then walk.
Now, from where you sit, senior executive, what would you describe as what makes a good negotiator?
Well, as I said earlier, the number one thing is to walk, is be able to walk and be willing to walk, which means that when you go into the negotiation, you've done your preparatory work. You actually do know exactly what this company is worth to you and how you're going to add value. And often equally important is all the other terms and conditions, where the risks are. So what are you going to want warranties and how are you going to back those warranties and how are you going to mitigate the risks involved in it. So you have to have a clear bottom line and not be bothered by the fact that, it may be that they're going to try to get more or they perceive it is worth more. And you say, well, if it is worth more, you shouldn't sell it to me. You should sell it to someone who is willing to pay that price. So I think psychologically not saying success is my getting this deal versus we say success is getting the deal in the terms that we would want to do. I'd say that's probably the critical thing. I think the second thing is probably being mature and not being emotional, being very calm, not getting in, because deals often, there's a lot of energy gets running in a deal, and just staying relaxed and calm during the deal and recognizing that deals generally take a lot longer than people expect them to.
Where would a concession strategy come into play? You've got your business operations guy who recommends the deal. You've got corporate development who are looking at it, pretty impressed, would like to proceed. But at the end of the day, the other side is going to want some form of concession, whether it be a higher price, whether it better be something else. Where does the concession strategy? Do you become actively involved at that point in time in terms of a potential acquisition?
Yeah, one of the things that we try to do is keep me out of the deals because you do ultimately need to say, I don't think I can sell that. Whereas as soon as you put your king on the table, then I can't say, well, I don't think I can sell that because I'm the one that has to be sold it. And so I think it's always important to keep one player back that isn't in the front line of the deal. I think the key on concessions is to understand what the other side is coming, where they're coming from, and what their issues. And so there are often in negotiations things that matter a lot to the seller that don't matter as much to the buyer. And that's where you end up making the deal, is you concede the points that don't matter as much to you and give them the points that do. So that's where I think it is worth spending time talking through and trying to figure out what really matters to the other side. And it's often quite surprising things that you think, well, why do they care so much about that? But it turns out they really do care. And often, if you're buying companies, you've not just got the management team, you've got the board, and you may have significant shareholders, and each of them will have different things that matter. So you try to figure out what those are and, how to give them that in return to get what we want.
Other than monetary concerns, what would those concerns might be?
Oh, they might be name. Is my name going to get preserved? Board seats, are they going to get there? It could be, long-term contracts. If depending on who the owner was, well, do I get a long-term contract out of this to keep on supplying that entity? Just different things like that. It'll matter. Employment, like are you leaving my region? So do I have to announce to the world that I sold the company and we're going to lay off all the workers? So what are you doing on those? There's a lot of these issues that surround that matter. People want to feel good in the end when they're selling the company.
Now, I would think reputation, the reputation of the bank, reputation of your management is pretty important to you as a CEO. How does that play in the acquisition strategy? For instance, would your bank deal or work with other institutions that are not as have the high reputation that the Toronto Dominion Bank would have? How do you evaluate that reputational loss or advantage?
Yeah, so absolutely, you're right, absolutely critical. And so if we get a sense in doing an acquisition that we're stepping into a company that has been run at the margin, a lot of red flags go up, and unless we can be absolutely certain that we could structure the deal that would give us not just legal immunity but reputational immunity.
Because there's two tests, really, isn't
Right.
there? I mean, there's the legal test,
Right.
and then there's the
smell test, right? Yeah, no, exactly. And so one of the attractions of FDIC deals is that, in a sense, it does a cleansing for both of those. It definitely gives you a legal cleansing, but it does give you can say, well, the world knows that this was an institution that had collapsed, been seized by the government. There might have been some unsavory stuff, but it wasn't obviously, you didn't do that, and you're buying it clean, and you're trying to buy it clean. But it is definitely, something that you worry about, both because of the reputational, but I guess the other thing I would say is because those issues often consume huge amounts of energy. And in the end of the day, people underestimate, I think, the costs of those kind of energies. And so if you're running a big organization, you want people to get up every morning and do the things that make customer and clients better off and to make the bank and the shareholders better off. And if you get yourself down into a hole, if you take a look at the United States and the mortgage business, where the energy is all being spent trying to clean up bad processes, you can stall out an organization.
Tell me about transparency. I mean, TD under your leadership has had an incredible run of success. One of the darlings, if you will, in the financial community. Your relationship with the regulators seem to be first class. Is my assumption correct that transparency is another important value that the bank holds? And if so, can you provide us with some insight in terms of how that works to your favor by being so transparent?
Yeah, I think it's actually the whole foundation of both your internal relations with your employees, your relations with your customers, your relations with the board, shareholders, and absolutely regulators. And so we really do believe firmly, just tell it as it is. It's just too hard to do it otherwise, and it's enormously comforting. I think if you talk to my board members, what they like about the board is that I start every board meeting with, here are all the bad things happening right now at TD. And here are all the things that are going wrong. Here are all the problems that I'm stewing about. Key in doing that is to say, I'm not passing these up. This is not upward delegation. I own all this. But you should be aware of it. I do not want you ever to be blindsided to say, geez, we didn't even know that this was happening here. So I think you want to make sure that people, in a sense, really do understand. Another kind of expression is, I always say to people, round down, not up. The good news will go up easy enough. Don't worry about that. But people want to hear about the things that are going wrong. And if you're going to present views, make sure that you're not exaggerating. I think there's an element, you run the risk, and so we get some criticism in the investor community that TD is always too conservative in its outlook. And so we're always highlighting all the things that could go wrong rather than all the things that go right in the next year. I think you have to, so you could overdo it in either side, but I think it's better to make sure your investors know that here are the risks. One of the things I say when I meet with a new investor is, I am not here to sell TD stock. That's not my job. My job is to run the bank and to tell you exactly what we're going to do and then do exactly what I told you we were going to do. And it's you to figure out whether you'd want to invest in that stock or not. So what's critical to that is that I actually am transparent and I do it, because that's all you can hold me to is, did you do exactly what you said? Because, if you look at our stock, we're a conservatively run institution. We've said we're not trying to shoot the lights out. We don't take tail risk. We just believe we can go along steadily and take market share and grow fast, faster than I think our competitors, and with less risk. That's what we're doing. But if you want a go-go stock, you might pick someone else. Or if you want a beat-up stock, you might pick someone else. So you really want to appeal to a set of investors that say, I want a steady machine that I know what they can do. And that's where transparency is so important.
Share with us the risk analysis that the bank does, whether it be in an acquisition, whether it be submitting a position to the regulator, what sort of risk analysis do you do? I would think it would be fairly comprehensive.
Yeah, I think the two core elements is first you really just have to have people who are experts in whatever assets you're buying. Do they really understand what's the risk that inherent to them?
Some of those individuals would be outside the bank, would they not? As specialists?
Quite rarely, I would say. I think for us to be buying something where we didn't have people inside who knew at it, that would be a very unusual move for us. So I would say if we had to go outside, we'd probably say that's probably not a good acquisition for us. But the other thing that we do, it's very important, is that we subject the entity then to a stress test and say, suppose we get this all wrong, or suppose the world goes badly, can we afford to take the losses, and is this within our risk appetite? And that's a critical second factor in all acquisitions.
Tell me a little bit about the internal auditor's certification with regards to your acquisition strategy. I don't know if I fully understood as to how that works.
Yeah, so we have a separate internal audit department that, in a sense, reports directly to me and to the board. And what they're really doing is going through and saying, have we done all the things that we're supposed to do in an acquisition and doing the due diligence? And are they satisfied that there aren't any risks that we haven't looked at? And has there been any modification in how we did this from other acquisitions? So has there been leaning on it to try to get this one through when it shouldn't have got through? And they report independently to the board to say, no, we're satisfied that we're still doing it the right way.
Final question. We talked in the beginning in terms of your great successes. What are some of the big challenges for the bank today and moving forward?
Yeah, I'd say without question, and I think this would apply to a number of well-run banks, is we're living in a world where even if you've done everything right, you cannot make your bank immune from what the global forces that are at play. And so, we have very well contained risk, tremendous capital, lots of liquidity, but if there's a European crisis or the United States goes into a deep recession, TD's going to be impacted. It can't outrun those macro impacts. So you're constantly sitting there saying, is there anything more that I can do to safeguard the institution? And I think we make sure that there isn't and that it can withstand even those kind of crises.
Well, what about the international perspective that comes towards that you have for a particular deal? Any goalposts that you look at? If you're making a major deal in the United States, what sort of things would you be looking at in terms of the international perspective? We know what's going on in Europe. We know about the huge political fix or problem, if you will, in the United States. How would that affect your particular deal, whether to go or not to go?
Well, because we'd go back to the stress test. And so we actually consciously, when we went in the United States and bought those banks, we stressed exactly what happened in the United States. In fact, we stressed worse than what was actually happened to us and said, could we live with that outcome? So that's why it's very important to do the stress and say, bad things can happen in the future. Would you still do this deal if those bad things happen?
Ed, on behalf of the Ted Rogers School of Management, I want to express our sincere appreciation for joining us here today and giving us your perspective on a variety of different topics. Thank you very much and continued success.